You ready?
Yes.
Ready?
Yeah.
Good morning. My name's Tayyab Ali. I'm a partner of Byman's LLP and a director of the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians. I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for attending our press conference today. Before we start, just a little bit of housekeeping. On the board behind me, on the screen behind me, you'll see a QR code. For those that are attending via live link, that QR code will take you to a platform where you can submit questions, which will appear on my laptop magically. And in the questions and answer session, I will be able to read those questions out for you, and hopefully my colleagues on the panel will be able to answer them. So for over a year now, a coalition has been formed between the International Federation of Journalists, the Palestinian Journalists Syndicate, and the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians, working with lawyers from Doughty Street and Byman's LLP. The coalition was formed to hold Israel armed forces to account for what appears to be a policy of targeting, maiming, and killing journalists and the destruction of civilian media infrastructure in Palestine. The coalition's legal work led first to a communication to the United Nations, and in April 2022, following months of preparation and investigation, we presented a complaint to the International Criminal Court in respect of Israel's alleged policy of targeting journalists. The April complaint details the systematic targeting of Palestinian journalists on behalf of 4 named victims: Ahmed Abu Hussein, Yasser Mutaja, Muath Amaneh, and Nidal Estia, who were killed or maimed by Israeli snipers while covering demonstrations in Gaza. All were clearly marked all had clearly marked press vests at the time they were shot. In addition, our complaint also details the targeting and bombing of the Al-Sharuk and Al-Jawharat media towers in Gaza City in May 2021. You'll hear more about this from my colleague Jennifer. The need for legal action can be seen in the numbers. According to reports, at least 50 journalists, mostly Palestinians, have been killed by Israeli fire in the West Bank since 2000. Most of the cases involve Palestinian journalists, but also do include foreign journalists. No one has been held to account for these maimings or deaths or attacks. The pattern of Israeli armed forces attacking journalists is not new, but again, on 11th of May, 2 Al Jazeera journalists were shot, one fatally. Shireen Abu Akleh, a well-known Palestinian-American TV journalist, was killed whilst covering Israeli army raids in the city of Jenin. Ali, who was present when Shireen was killed, was shot in the shoulder and hospitalized. We, in our coalition, are honored to be able to announce today that Shireen's brother, Tariq Anton Abu Akleh, and Ali Samoudi, and Shasta Han Aisha, who witnessed the attack, have provided our group with the authority and instructions to submit a new complaint to the International Criminal Court about the circumstances surrounding Shireen's death and Ali's shooting on the 11th of May. Ali, along with other witnesses, are providing our coalition with crucial eyewitness testimony with regards to Ali's shooting and the death of Shireen. There are strong grounds to believe that Shireen was killed and Ali was shot by Israeli armed forces. Both join a long list of journalists targeted by the Israeli armed forces in the Occupied Palestinian Territories. This new complaint on behalf of Ali and Shireen follows our April 2022 submission to the ICC, which requested the ICC prosecutor launch an investigation into the systematic targeting, maiming, and killing of journalists and the destruction of media infrastructure. Shireen was killed only days after the ICC prosecutor acknowledged receipt of our first complaint. Israel has enjoyed a devastating impunity against accountability for the actions of its armed forces, and has repeatedly demonstrated that it is a bad faith investigator. It has not managed to hold anyone to account for the tens of Palestinian journalists that have been killed or maimed so far. Crucially, on the 5th of February 2021, the International Criminal Court ruled that its criminal jurisdiction extended to the situation in Palestine, and that its territorial scope covered allegations that occurred in Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. This presents, for the first time, a real opportunity for accountability of Israel's alleged policy of targeting journalists, and could lead to a formal investigation by the ICC prosecutor and potential prosecutions of the perpetrators. We welcome Al Jazeera's own initiative to provide a complaint to the ICC as a media institution, which we are sure will add force to the complaint we submitted in April and our new complaint on behalf of the family of Shireen and Ali and Shasta as individuals. Our guest Walid will speak more about this soon. Shireen's family and Ali have trusted us to bring what happened to them to the attention of the International Criminal Court and to the world. Shireen is not anonymous. She was one of us. She dedicated her life to one of the most important principles in democracy, freedom of speech. As a journalist, Shireen's work ensured that the world knew what was happening in Palestine. Journalists like Shireen and Ali are crucial in holding governments that violate international law to account. Israel's belligerent and excessive use of force has led to irreversible damage and the killing of innocent journalists. This can no longer be allowed to continue. We are determined in our legal work to reverse Israel's ongoing impunity. There could not be a more important time than now for the ICC and the international community to send a clear signal to states that further their own interests through criminal acts that they will not have impunity and will instead be swiftly held to account. I'll be shortly introducing our speakers to you in turn, but before we do that, it will be useful for you to see some of our allegations in pictorial form. And we've prepared a short video for you to watch, which highlights some of the evidence that's readily available about the victims in our original complaint. I warn you that some of the images are graphic and some of the parts of the video are silent because we've chosen not to add anything to the videos and leave them in their raw form. So where there's natural sound, that's there. Where there's no natural sound, it's silent. If we could show the video, please.
تروين ما تروثين
انت ليه انا دي شاطر كوارث
اللي حتسبوا شاتي
انت ليه كبير
اللي حتسبوا شاتي
انت شاطر كوارث
يعني مجرد ما صار لي لأول مرة هي يعني ممكن بتصير إنه جندي بيحملوا كاميرتهم اللي بيصوروا فيها وبنزل بحط الكاميرا بوجهي وبصير يحكي إنه هدول بيمثلوا بيتخوثوا علينا، مش إحنا اللي صبناهم، من هذا الحكي يعني.
لن أنسى أبداً حجم الدمار ولا الشعور بأن الموت كان أحياناً على مسافة قريبة. لم نكن نرى بيوتنا، كنا نحمل الكاميرات ونتنقل عبر الحواجز العسكرية والطرق الوعرة. كنا نبيت في مستشفيات أو عند أناس لم نعرفهم، ورغم الخطر كنا نصر على مواصلة العمل. كان ذلك خلال عام 2002 حين تعرضت الضفة الغربية لاجتياح لم تعهده منذ احتلال عام 67. في اللحظات الصعبة تغلبت على الخوف، فقد اخترت الصحافة كي أكون قريبة من الإنسان. ليس سهلا ربما أن أغير الواقع، لكنني على الأقل كنت قادرة على إيصال ذلك الصوت إلى العالم. أنا شيرين أبو عقلة.
The one thing I'd like to say about the evidence in these cases is that the evidence is not the problem. We have ample evidence. You can see from the video clips how compelling some of the video clips are. We chose to blur the faces of potential suspects in the case, but we have the footage which shows their faces. The evidence is not the problem. The problem is holding Israel to account, Israel holding, the international community holding Israel to account, and the failure in doing that. And we thought we'd also play a few words from Shireen, as you saw at the end of that clip, so she could posthumously explain her role and what she was doing. I'd like to introduce Jennifer Robinson. Jennifer is an international law barrister at Doughty Street, Chambers, and instructor to act in our ICC complaint. Jennifer will discuss the legal strategies for accountability in response to the targeting of Palestinian journalists, including our recent ICC complaint, and provide an overview of our clients' cases. Jennifer.
Thank you, Tyab, and good morning, everyone. On behalf of myself and my colleague, Dr. Tatiana Eatwell, who's the head of our Doughty Street International team, we welcome you to Chambers this morning and thank you all for coming. It's an honour and a privilege for us to be instructed to represent Shireen Abu Akleh, Ali Samoudi and Shada Hanasia. We pay tribute to Shireen Abu Akleh and her work in a world where there are too few prominent women journalists, and we thank her bereaved family for entrusting us with taking her case to the ICC. We also pay tribute to Ali Samoudi, who was shot and seriously injured in the same incident, and Shada Hanasia, who was shot at and witnessed the killing. They survived an incredibly traumatic event, and we want to ensure that through our international advocacy and our work, that their cases also receive the international attention that they deserve. We will now be joining all of these journalists as victims in the complaint that we filed to the ICC in April about the targeting of Palestinian journalists by Israeli forces. That complaint, as Tyab mentioned, was originally filed on behalf of 4 named journalists: Ahmed Abu Hussein, Yasser Mataja, Muat Armaneh, and Nedal Eshtaye. Each of them were killed or maimed by Israeli snipers while reporting. All of these journalists, like Shireen Abu Akleh, were shot while clearly wearing marked press vests and press helmets. Our complaint also details the deliberate targeting and bombing of media infrastructure in Gaza in May 2021. As we warned in our ICC complaint back in April, the attacks on Palestinian journalists by the Israeli Defense Force have been widespread and systematic, and the threat of ongoing attacks against journalists is clear. Sadly, Shireen Abu Akleh's murder is a clear demonstration of the ongoing threat posed to journalists and Palestinian journalists reporting in the occupied territories, and the urgent need to address impunity for these attacks. This is precisely what our ICC complaint sets out to do, to ensure those who are responsible are held accountable, and this is why we submit that the ICC prosecutor should investigate and prosecute those responsible. Can we sort out the sound? Sorry about this, guys. the sound? Yeah. Sorry. Got that many, John?
Sorry about this, everybody. We'll just take a few moments to fix this feedback loop.
Okay. Continue.
I apologise for that. Sorry, Jennifer. Would you like to continue?
Sure. Our ICC complaint sets out to hold those responsible and to ensure that they're held accountable. This is why that we submit the ICC prosecutor must investigate our complaints and prosecute those responsible to send a clear message not just to the Israeli forces and government, but to all governments that targeting journalists is a crime and journalists are not fair game. Today I want to cover 3 brief points in relation to our legal work. First, provides a short bit of background about our work with the ICJP and the IFJ and PJS, a little bit about our international legal strategy, and some information about our clients, the legal case, and next steps. We first began working on this back in 2019 with the IFJ. The targeting of journalists in the context of armed conflict is an increasing global trend, and one that we've sadly seen in the context of the conflict in the Ukraine. Journalists play an essential role at the front lines, providing us an objective account of what's happening on the front line and documenting war crimes and human rights abuse. Sadly, this means that this is also why journalists become a target for governments who wish to hide the truth and to cover up war crimes and enable impunity. This has long been a problem for Palestinian journalists. The Journalists' Local and International Union, the Palestinian Journalists Syndicate, and the International Federation of Journalists has long and for many years been condemning the targeting and killing of Palestinian journalists and the broader discrimination and obstacles they face in doing their work as journalists on that front line. To give a brief overview of the issue, the extent of the problem and what prompted our work, I want to give you some facts. Back in 2019, a UN Commission of Inquiry into the 2018 protests found that 2 journalists, 2 of our clients, were killed while wearing press vests, and 39 others were injured by live ammunition. The following year, in 2019, the Palestinian Journalists Syndicate reported that 200 journalists had been physically attacked and dozens more were injured by rubber-coated bullets and live ammunition. And yet, in response to these attacks on Palestinian journalists, there were no investigations and no prosecutions. No one has been held accountable. And as a result of that impunity, the attacks continue. When we commenced our work in 2018, our aim was to work with the unions, victim journalists and their bereaved families to file international complaints and conduct international advocacy to both the UN and to the ICC to highlight the need to end this impunity and to protect the important work of journalists on the front line. We also wanted to make clear the legal position, and I do so today. The deliberate targeting of journalists is, in all situations, a grave violation of the right to life under international human rights law, and in situations of armed conflict that includes occupation, a violation of international humanitarian law and a war crime. As civilians in armed conflict, journalists are not legitimate targets. The deliberate targeting of journalists is not just a war crime, but in our view it's a war crime to cover up other war crimes, to cover up and prevent reporting on conflict and on war crimes themselves. In this work, we also wanted to make sure that we raise the targeting of freelance journalists in particular, those who work and those who work for smaller media organisations. Too often they are targeted without the benefit of large international media organisations to do advocacy on their behalf. So sadly, the recent killing of Shireen Abu Akleh shows that working for a large international media organisation provides no protection for journalists. In working with the IFJ, we identified the 4 first cases which we believe are emblematic of the broader problem of targeting of journalists in Palestine. You've seen on the video those 4 journalists. The first 2 were killed during the 2018 protests. Ahmad Abu Hussein, a 24-year-old journalist who was fatally shot in the abdomen by an IDF sniper. He'd been taking photographs of the demonstrations and was clearly wearing a blue helmet and a press vest. Yasser Mataja was a 30-year-old photographer and media company owner who had also been wearing a blue press vest when he was shot and lethally wounded while filming demonstrations for a documentary. Both of their cases were investigated and highlighted by the UN Commission of Inquiry in 2019, which concluded that they were both killed while wearing press vests. The UN inquiry also concluded that there were reasonable grounds to believe that Israeli snipers had shot them intentionally. Our clients also include 2 journalists who were maimed and lethally targeted. Muath Armaneh is a 33-year-old journalist and photographer who was shot in the eye in 2019 by the IDF while wearing a bulletproof vest with a press logo and again a press helmet. He had to have multiple surgeries to remove the shrapnel from his eye and to remove his eye, but he continues to suffer physically and psychologically and hasn't been able to continue his work or protect and provide for his family. He made a police report to Palestinian authorities in Bethlehem. The Israeli authorities never asked him for a statement and there's been no investigation to our knowledge. Nedal Eshtayeh is a 53-year-old freelance journalist. He was shot in 2015 with a rubber bullet in the eye while filming the soldier who shot him. He'd been wearing his press vest and a helmet. He suffered nerve atrophy, loss of vision, and requires continuing treatment. After there was no criminal investigation, he did seek reparations in the Israeli courts, a civil claim to seek compensation for the shooting, but the Israeli courts determined that they had immunity from that suit. His work continues, but at great risk. He was shot again in 2021. These 2 cases demonstrate the problem that we're identifying in our complaint, which is the immense difficulty for Palestinian journalist victims to seek reparations and justice in the Israeli courts. And this is why we say the ICC complaint is so necessary. We are instructed by each of the journalists who were targeted, or on behalf of their bereaved family members. We pay tribute to each of them and to their families for taking action to try to protect other journalists. We also pay tribute to the work of the unions who really initiated this work, the Palestinian Journalists Syndicate and the International Federation of Journalists, for their invaluable support for Palestinian journalists and media workers, and for their families to enable this work to take place. As Tayeb mentioned, our first line of international advocacy was to make a UN complaint to the UN Special Rapporteurs at the end of 2020. To that complaint, we have had no response. After the ICC prosecutor announced her investigation in early 2021, we started working with the ICJP to put together our ICC complaint on behalf of those 4 journalists. Soon afterwards, we saw the deliberate targeting and bombing of the towers in Gaza in May 2021, and we added that targeting to the ICC complaint. This week, we have been instructed by Shireen Abu Akleh's family, along with the other journalists targeted in that incident, to add them to our ICC complaint and our broader international advocacy. Just briefly on the ICC complaint, it was filed under Article 15 of the Rome Statute, requesting that the prosecutor, Karim Khan, open an investigation under Article 53 of the statute. Our complaint alleges various war crimes under Article 8 and crimes against humanity on the basis of the widespread and systematic nature of the targeting of Palestinian journalists. We submit that these complaints are admissible because of the repeated failure of the Israeli authorities to properly investigate and prosecute those responsible, and because of the gravity of their offences. In terms of next steps, we will soon be adding Shireen Abu Akleh's cases and the other cases to our ICC complaint. It's important to recognise that the UN and international community has long known about this problem. We want to highlight today the cumulative effect of the ongoing impunity for Israeli forces, and that is the continuing attack on journalists. Action must be taken to ensure that Israel observes its international obligations under international human rights law and international humanitarian law. We say that it's important because not just because Shireen Abu Akleh's of her case, which is of course high profile, but it is not a one-off. There is a repeated pattern of targeting of journalists, and this has to stop. If this impunity continues, journalists will continue to be killed, which is why the IFJ and the PJS initiated this work to protect media workers. It's time for the ICC to take action to send a clear message to the Israeli government and to all governments that targeting journalists is not fair game. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. I'd like to now introduce Jim Bomela, who will speak on behalf of the International Federation of Journalists, representing 600,000 journalists worldwide. He led the organisation as its president from 2007 to 2016 and is still currently in its leadership. Jim.
Thank you. Good morning, colleagues, and greetings on behalf of the International Federation of Journalists and its affiliated unions worldwide, among them the Palestinian Journalists Syndicate. The murder of Shireen has captured the attention of dozens of international institutions and agencies, politicians, celebrities, labor organizations, governments, millions of ordinary citizens. The list is endless. But for us, the crucial question is not just to comprehend this extraordinary outpouring of emotion her killing has triggered, how she became an emblem of the targeting of other Palestinian journalists by Israeli forces. It is this targeting has been going on for decades and has gone unpunished for such a long time, as Jennifer said. All these murders and hundreds of attacks are well documented. The long list and the circumstances surrounding their killings are available. And in every case, the soldier or the police officer or the border guard who pulled the trigger, the commanders who gave the orders, the politicians who make the excuses, they all get scot-free. And in a case closer to our Union of Journalists here in the UK, the victim was a British citizen, James Miller, who was shot and killed while filming a documentary in Gaza in May 2003. His colleagues and witnesses saw an Israeli tank opening fire. James was dressed in protective gear and marked as journalist, just like Shireen and all the others. The Israeli military denied responsibility, and as in the other cases, a subsequent Israeli investigator exonerated the troops involved. And as of today, no one in Israel has been charged. And we can scrutinize every case in the list of killed journalists, a list not put together by the alphabet soup of NGOs, but by the organization of journalists themselves. You will find that nobody has been held to account. And this means that it's almost virtually risk-free for an Israeli soldier to kill a journalist in Palestine. Murder seems to become the easiest and the most effective way of silencing troublesome journalists. And let's not forget that these murders also have an enormous impact beyond the incident themselves. They send a signal to countless others that they could well be next. These generate a fear that is hard to measure. And you can imagine the amount of courage and dedication, the reporting the truth that journalists, photographers, and camera crew every day to stand in front of the Israeli guns to do their job as journalists. The IFJ has been engaged in supporting Palestinian journalists from the first day they joined us 40 years ago. And we have a massive knowledge of what has been happening to them almost on a daily basis. We organized dozens of missions and visits to the region, issued scores of reports and recommendations, and released hundreds of statements protesting the treatment and the killing of journalists. And not a day passes by without a Palestinian journalist facing the prospect of being hit intentionally by a rubber bullet or being at the receiving end of a soldier rifle butt, or in the worst scenario, being shot at. And you have also seen the number of journalists attacked by Israeli settlers increase. And while so many organizations and individuals only discovered after the shooting of Shireen what's been happening to Palestinian journalists, we know in great detail the ordeal they face almost on a daily basis, thanks to the monumental effort by the union, the PGS, to tell the world their stories. The professional reports that they produce each quarter document every journalist who is hit by a rubber bullet or a stun grenade, and every arrest and humiliation is recorded. And this report makes staggering reading. In 2021, they listed more than 877 violations of media and journalists' rights. And during the difficult time of the attack on the Aqsa Mosque in May 21, the Union documented 179 journalists injured in a matter of days. And for every single case, we have made repeated calls for concerted international efforts to protect Palestinian journalists and put to an end the impunity. And this is why our joint effort to submit complaints to the ICC is such a historical turning point. We could quite easily submit scores of complaints, but we have chosen to submit the cases that Jennifer has outlined. And we all know in particular that the legal profession, academics, human rights experts, diplomats about the dozens of tools and instruments that, if used, can bring an end to impunity, including international humanitarian laws, universal human rights laws, covenants, declarations, UN resolution, and they compel states, including Israel, to prevent, investigate, and punish crime against journalists, and set out its responsibility to protect them from being killed, ill treatment, and unlawful arrest. For decades, we have been pressing Israel to abide by international standards and also to recognize Palestinians as journalists. Israel may be the only country in the world that refused to recognize our ICJP press card, which is a clear demonstration that they are not prepared, despite our continuous campaigning, to recognize Palestinian journalists as journalists, to recognize their dignity and to recognize their right to be there to report. By putting themselves at arm's length every day, these brave journalists speak truth to power just like any other journalist in the world, like journalists in this room. Even at times where their voice is shaky, they have the right to tell the truth, and the world deserves to hear their stories without them putting their lives at risk. Finally, I join all the colleagues here to thank and pay tribute to the hundreds of people of Palestine, the families of the victims, our colleague journalists and the media workers, the civil rights organization, and ordinary citizens. And we all, with one voice, appeal to the ICC to do the job that they're created to do and open an investigation forthwith. We've waited for far too long, and it's time to bring the perpetrators to justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jim. So I'd like to now introduce Nasser Abu Bakr, who is currently the president of the Palestinian Journalists Syndicate, a trade union which represents 2,500 working journalists throughout Palestine. Unfortunately, Nasser can't be with us at the moment, and so what he's done instead is sent a video, which we'll play for you now.
مساء الخير للجميع. أولا أرحب بجميع الصحفيين الذين يحضرون مؤتمرنا الصحفي هذا في لندن، وأتقدم باسمي وباسم مجلس نقابة الصحفيين الفلسطينيين وعموم الصحفيين الفلسطينيين وعائلات الشهداء الصحفيين وباسم الجرحى والمعتقلين بالشكر الجزيل لطاقم المحامين البارزين في مجال حقوق الإنسان من مكتبي بايبنز ودوت ستريت تشامبرز والمركز الدولي للعدالة للفلسطينيين والاتحاد الدولي للصحفيين ممثلا بالسادة جود بوبلحا وأنتوني بلنجي وجيرمي. وكما أتقدم بالشكر الجزيل لاتحاد الصحفيين البريطاني والإيرلندي ممثلا بالسيدة ميشيل سانتريست على الجهود التي بذلوها من أجل أن نوصل إلى هذه اللحظات. إن نقابة الصحفيين لطالما وعدت على مدار السنوات السابقة بأنها ستتقدم بشكاوى ضد جرائم الحرب بحق الصحفيين الفلسطينيين لمحكمة الجنايات الدولية، والتي نرى أن كل هذه الجرائم ضد صحفيين هي حالات إعدام وجرائم حرب ترتكب من قبل جيش الاحتلال الإسرائيلي، وآخرها جريمة اغتيال وإعدام زميلتنا شيرين أبو عاقلة التي قتلها جنود الاحتلال في مدينة جنين. وقد شكل قتلها من قبل جيش الاحتلال الإسرائيلي تطورا خطيرا يهدد حياة كل الصحفيين الفلسطينيين، مما يستوجب أن نذهب إلى محكمة الجنايات الدولية بأسرع وقت ممكن لمحاكمة الجناة والقتلة، ومن أجل توفير حماية دولية حقيقية للصحفيين الفلسطينيين. والآن وبعد إعدام زميلتنا شيرين، فإن نقابة الصحفيين قررت بالتعاون مع الاتحاد الدولي للصحفيين تقديم شكوى أخرى بقضية إعدام شيرين أبو عاقلة لمحكمة الجنايات الدولية. إن هدفنا الآن أن نصل إلى المرحلة التالية بإعلان السيد كريم خان عن بدء التحقيق الفوري في القضايا المقدمة له، لأننا نرى أن فتح التحقيق الفوري مسألة باتت في غاية الأهمية من عدة جوانب. أولا، إن القضايا والشكاوى موثقة بشكل قانوني مهني، وهي جرائم موثقة ارتكبها جيش الاحتلال الإسرائيلي ضد صحفيين مدنيين عزل يقومون بواجبهم المهني، آخرهم الصحفية شيرين أبو عاقلة. إن فتح التحقيق من قبل النائب العام السيد كريم خان يأتي بعد انطباق حالة فلسطين على محكمة الجنايات الدولية. نريد من المحاسبة والمحاكمة لمرتكبي الجرائم بحق الصحفيين الفلسطينيين ألا يفلت مرتكبو الجرائم من العقاب وفق قرار الجمعية العامة للأمم المتحدة لعام 2013. رابعا، نريد أن تشكل المحاكمة لمرتكبي الجرائم ضد الصحفيين مدخلا لتوفير حماية دولية للصحفيين الفلسطينيين، سيما أنه ارتفع منذ عام 2000 وحتى يومنا هذا عدد الصحفيين الذين قتلوا إلى أكثر من 50 صحفيا. ومنذ عام 2013 وحتى الآن سجلت لجنة الحريات في نقابة الصحفيين أكثر من 7000 اعتداء وجريمة بحق الصحفيين الفلسطينيين، وعدد كبير من الصحفيين أصيب عدة مرات ومنهم أصيب عشرات المرات. إن هذا الاستهداف الممنهج والمقصود لم نعد قادرين على احتمال المزيد منه كصحفيين فلسطينيين، بل نخشى من تصعيده وزيادته بكل الأشكال، والاستهداف الذي يشكل خطرا حقيقيا على كل صحفي فلسطيني، خاصة العاملين في تغطية الأحداث في الميدان وعلى الأرض. كلنا ثقة بكم ونشكركم جميعا مرة أخرى، ونأمل أن يعلن السيد كريم خان عن فتح التحقيق بأسرع وقت ممكن. تحياتي للجميع.
Thank you very much, Nasser. Finally, I'd like to turn to our guest today, who is Walid Al-Omri. We welcome him to our press conference. Walid is the bureau chief, the Jerusalem bureau chief for Al Jazeera, and he worked directly with Shireen and the other journalists in our complaint. Walid.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I have very important announcement to make. Al Jazeera has decided to take Shireen's case to ICC to hold her killer accountable and bring justice to Shireen. In addition, Al Jazeera is exploring all legal possibilities and is determined to bring justice to Shireen. And we welcome every initiative to follow up on this crime. I like to take this opportunity to thank the organizers of this press conference in solidarity with Shireen and all other Palestinian journalists targeted by Israeli occupation forces. IFJ, Palestinian Journalists Syndicate, International Center of Justice for Palestinians, Doughty Street Chambers, Bindman's LLP. Shireen Abu Akleh was iconic and recognizable person. She was assassinated by the Israeli military army, the same occupation force who occupied Palestinian territory for 55 years. Now, and after more than 2 weeks of Shireen's assassination, we have at least 4 investigative reports. The last one was published yesterday by the Palestinian Attorney General. The investigation reveals that the bullet that killed Shireen is a type of bullet capable of penetrating to body armor and helmets, and all elements emphasize premeditated murder. This important report confirms the CNN report published on 24th of May that explains that Shireen was targeted by the Israeli army. It also confirms the AP report that was published 1 day before. All those investigative reports reconfirms what Al Jazeera said around the murder of her dearest senior correspondent, the truth, and denies the Israeli claims. Now I have presentation telling the story for you. Yes. Yeah. The day of crime, Wednesday, May 11th, 2022. The location was Jenin city and refugee camp north of the occupied West Bank. The crime occurred while Shireen was doing her job as journalist covering a military incursion of the camp. Shireen sent last email to Al Jazeera newsroom in Qatar at 6:13 early morning. The text telling Al Jazeera that occupation military forces enter and besiege a house in Al Jabriyat neighborhood. We are on the way there. I will send an update once the details are clear. Shireen and her crew and SNG broadcast van left the hotel heading to the refugee camp in the western part of the West Bank town of Jenin. At 6:27 a.m., local Palestinian news group published the news about the injury of Ali Samoudi, the local producer assisting Shireen. Shireen was shot immediately after. This is the email. I forgot even to mention that. What is the other? Yeah. I was informed by someone inside the hospital in Jenin of Shireen's death at 6:38. I did not announce it immediately as we had to contact her brother and family first, and we awaited the announcement by the Palestinian Ministry of Health. At 7:13 a.m., I announced the tragic news live on Al Jazeera while I was on my way from Ramallah to Jenin. Shireen, her crew, and SNG arrived to where other journalists were gathered. Israeli occupation troops had taken position at the other end of a street that intersects with this street. Second, after Shireen and her crew prepared themselves by putting on the press labeled bulletproof vest and protective helmet, they began walking forward carefully with assisting local producer Ali Samoudi and local journalist Mujahid Al-Saadi and Shada Hanaishi. All of these journalists were wearing protective gear labeled clearly as press. The group of journalists was walking about 170 meters away from where the Israeli soldiers were positioned, and their journalists were fully exposed to the soldier. Fourth, there were no Palestinian protesters nor any armed men or resistance fighters present at the same location where this group of journalists was present. This is confirmed by photos and eyewitnesses. In this image, you can see clearly Shireen and other journalists walking near a wall. As you see them there, the three people in this picture. In this video, can you do it from there? It's better if somebody can do it from there, and I will follow from my computer because it's. Go back. Yes, this is video. There is video here. Yeah, this one. Yeah. In this video, we can hear Shireen say Ali was injured. Seconds before, she was fatally shot. After Ali Samoudi is injured, this video shows him running to a nearby car to get transferred to hospital, and Shireen is seen running back and trying to hide. After another round of gunfire, the camera shows Shireen on the ground. Yes. Journalist and colleague Shada Hanaishi tried to approach Shireen from behind a nearby tree, even though she was terrified. But the Israeli occupation forces' ongoing fire prevented her from reaching Shireen. Both Al-Najah University forensic report and Palestinian public prosecution's report confirmed that Shireen was hit by a bullet fired from a powerful and fast weapon. The bullet entered from under her left ear and pierced through her head to the top of the right side of her head. The bullet did not go out of her head because the helmet prevented it, which left marks inside the helmet. Hair was stuck inside the helmet and obvious cracks in its outer shell. The injury was fatal. The conditions under which the shooting took place in terms of location, timing, and details of the injury all confirm that Shireen was shot by a sniper's rifle that targeted her as a direct mark. These conditions also confirm that the bullets fired could not have come from any other direction than that of where the occupation forces were situated, as there were no bullets fired from any other directions. Why do I say that? That is not an accusation in any way or form. Shireen, Ali, Shada, Mujahid, and all the other journalists and media crew that were with them were all wearing the required protective bulletproof vests and protective helmets, which clearly distinguish them as press journalists. These press vests are widely known to the Israeli military forces, and the crew was in a location where many other journalists had gathered, and they were clearly visible to the Israeli army jeeps. And Al Jazeera SNG broadcast van was parked in the same location, and it's widely known as well. Shireen was hit by a direct bullet behind the ear in a location that is not covered by the helmet or vests. She was killed with predetermination, and Ali was injured with intention as well. Why would they target Shireen and execute her in such a hideous crime? Why would they target Shireen? These three investigation reports that we have before the Palestinian investigative report that the Attorney General published yesterday. This is the CNN. His conclusion that Shireen was targeted. Before that, we have the AP, who said that the bullet fired from Israeli gunfire, and this is the first one, which was 3 days after they killed Shireen. It's from the Deutsch website who investigated the situation, and all of them, they confirm what I am saying here. Incitement that precedes the crime and the incitement and statements that followed, which were carried out by Israeli journalists and politicians, confirm that their goal was to, first, direct a powerful and painful blow at Al Jazeera because of its professional coverage after they failed at accusing Al Jazeera of lies and incitement. On June 5th, 2021, Al Jazeera correspondent Jazeera Abu was arrested and beaten in Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in Jerusalem, and on May 15th, 2021, they bombed and completely demolished the building in Gaza that hosts our bureau. We have videos here about these two incidents. This is the building where Al Jazeera was in Gaza that they bombed. And here we have our correspondent Jazeera Arabic when they beat him. Okay. Second, they choose Shireen because she was a senior correspondent for Al Jazeera. She is well known and had great journalistic stature in Al Jazeera and the Arab media sector. She is internationally known for her professionalism. Third, they know that Shireen is a Palestinian Christian, and they mistakenly thought that killing her would not anger the Palestinian public, which is largely Muslim with a Christian minority. And since they believe and claim that the Palestinian people are groups of fundamentalists, Islamists, and not humans, they thought that the Palestinian public will not be angered if the victim was Christian. They were mistaken. Fourth, they know that Shireen is an American citizen, but they assumed that this would force the USA to help them in obscuring the truth, as had happened with the murder of American Jew Rachel Corrie by an Israeli on the 16th of March, thinking that this will terrify other journalists from covering their hideous crimes. Now, after paying this heavy price, what I hear from my colleagues is the exact opposite. Instead of stopping their crimes, the occupation authorities broke the mirror that reflects the ugliness of their behavior. The Israeli occupation's positions and its propaganda. They changed their stories 7 times within 2 days after they killing Shireen. The first was, they published the first story, it was at 7:45 in the morning of Wednesday. First Israeli official statement was issued in Hebrew. Then they issued that in English, and they telling that the statement was issued 5 minutes after Shireen was executed. It stated that joint military forces from the Israeli army and the general security and border control had been activated during the past few hours in the refugee camp in Jenin. In the course of their activities, they became under fire, which they responded to, and injured were reported, and that they were inspecting the injury of a female journalist. In between, there is a website belonging to the settlers, a settler website which takes its information from the Israeli army, published a new stating that our forces have shot and wounded a number of terrorists in Jenin. A journalist from Al Jazeera was killed. Israeli authorities and media outlets continued to promote that story until the next day, when they retracted their story to state that investigations conducted by the Central Regional Command of the Israeli Army confirmed that a Duvduvan army unit fired tens of bullets in Jenin refugee camp. It was Haaretz who published this. The Israeli attack on the corpse of a funeral procession in the Saint Joseph French Hospital. This I will mention, and I will end with this, okay? If we were put everything I have just said aside, with your permission, to say that there are doubts regarding the identity of who committed the crime against Shireen, how can we then explain this? Israeli forces stormed into the hospital yard while mourners were preparing to begin Shireen's journey towards her final resting place, and they almost brought the coffin down to the ground. How can a person carrying the casket with both hands be able to get violent against the occupation armed soldiers and policemen who were beating them up? If we were to assume that there was actual violence, which did not happen, as I am an eyewitness myself, how can we explain this video? Inside the buildings, the soldiers inside the buildings of the hospital. Nobody can explain this at all. The last thing I just want to mention, and this quotation, the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Palestinian Issues, Francisca Abelpans, said in response to the execution of Shireen on May 22nd, 2020, we demand a transparent international investigation into the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh. It is the international community that has allowed Israel to evade decades of punishment for its crimes against the Palestinians. I call for the dismantling of the apartheid regime imposed by Israel on the Palestinians and the implementation of international law as in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. That was a really helpful insight into this, exactly what happened to Shireen and the situation in the Occupied Palestinian Territories. What's clear from our own investigation? Sorry. What's clear from our own investigation, as well as the detailed analysis that Walid presented, is that, and I say it again, evidence in these cases is not the issue. We have evidence. There are so many cameras, thanks to the journalists that work in the area, thanks to the invention of the mobile telephone camera. There is so much live evidence about what happens. There is so much evidence about the perpetrators. There is so much evidence which compels you to suspect that what happened was a targeted killing in most, if not all, of these cases that we've investigated and presented already to the International Criminal Court. It's the political will that's lacking. It's the fact that Israel is gifted impunity. It's the fact that Israel is allowed to continue an asymmetric relationship with the Palestinian people without any accountability whatsoever. Fatou Bensouda, the former ICC prosecutor, took a historic step in dealing with the complaint from the Palestinian Authority in a noble way, in a honest way. She took the complaint and referred it to the pretrial chamber, and the pretrial chamber ruled, as I said in my opening, that the ICC has jurisdiction over these crimes since 2014 to the present day. Fatou Bensouda's investigation also concluded that crimes were continuing, and we've seen that in the last few days and weeks, that crimes are still continuing in that region. It's now in the hands of Karim Khan, who's the new ICC prosecutor. And we've seen how important the rule of law and accountability is with regards to Ukraine. When the international community and the ICC want to move, they can move enormously quickly and prevent further loss of life. We've seen already in the Ukraine war crimes prosecution supported by the international community. We've seen nothing with regards to journalists or any other civilians in the occupied Palestinian territories. The important question is, why is there this difference? What makes the situation different? Because the allegations are similar. The deaths are similar. The wrong is the same. I'd like to open the floor for some questions. We have some questions coming through on the platform as well, but I'll first of all ask anybody in the room if they have a question. If you could please put your hand up, I'll select you, introduce your organisation and ask the question, and we'll decide who to answer that. Thank you. Please.
You say the evidence is not the issue, which is make it clear. You said the evidence is not the issue, which is make it clear you have enough evidence, as you said, is recorded by the camera. So ICC, why doesn't make any move? Especially we heard it's about 50 journalists killed since 2000 in Palestine.
I mean, this is I'll take this question. This is the point of our complaint, is that we see a prolonged system of attacks on journalists and civilians in the region. It's only actually very recently that the ICC has accepted that its jurisdiction covers the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories. Even that's too long, actually. But we're hoping very much now. I mean, like I said, this is a real possibility for the ICC to open a historic chapter in this story and actually hold people in the region accountable for the international crimes that they commit. We know already that Israel can't do it, won't do it, refuses to do it, provides disinformation about the allegations. Even as recently as yesterday, Benny Gatz's explanation about an acceptance about what potentially has happened is covered in spin and disinformation and misinformation. And so it's important that any investigation that's done is done by an independent institution such as the International Criminal Court. From where I'm sitting today, I can see no reason why the ICC would not proceed with an investigation and potential prosecutions in these cases.
Can I add something here in this point? Because if there is no accountability and punishment at this time, Shireen will not be the last Palestinian journalist to be executed by the Israeli occupation. Then, because that we need the protection, guarantees for Palestinians and Arab journalists, and at the same time, an international trial is essential through an international commission to guarantee this protection for and to accountability and punish the criminals who did that.
Thank you, Ali. We just have some limited time, so if I could just direct the questions, that'd be great.
Okay.
Thank you. Please.
So you've mentioned that there were plenty of evidence to prosecute and to go to the ICC, and the ICC has no excuse not to investigate this and hold those accountable to justice. You mentioned the political will. From whom? And are you concerned that some of the members of the international community would get involved to suppress such a case?
Well, only it has been historically that whenever there are cases and journalist organization have been, trying to get to the truth, that sometimes there are intervention from states. Only recently, in the case of Shireen, we had Boris Johnson already kind of interfering by even ahead of the ICC, making some comments that are not necessarily the position of the British government, but precisely to derail, what may be happening. That is how it could be interpreted. But I think at the end of the day, when we talk about evidence, it's not a case about one person or a particular person. It's the case of what's been happening over all these years. I mentioned James Miller. James Miller is our colleague. He's an English journalist. He was killed quite a while ago, and his parents, it was his parents, not the British government, who made a huge effort try to bring the people who killed him to justice. At the end of the day, it was the coroner in St. Pancras, just down the road, who took up the case, and they declared after a lot of hearing, and maybe not the kind of sophisticated evidence that we've got now, that he was directly shot by Israeli journalists, and the British government didn't lift a finger. No, sorry. Yeah. So there have been cases. I will just come back to the point that Jennifer made about other journalists that haven't got a big organization behind them. There are dozens. I mean, if you look at the evidence that the Palestinian Journalists Syndicate gather, the vast majority of these people, they're normal journalists. They haven't got an organization behind them. They're photographers. They're camera crews. So when it happened to them, they haven't got the strength. They haven't got the political strength, in order kind of to pursue it. Yes, we can focus on one person that's diplomatic, and that is good. If you manage, to get it to the court, there is a question about all the others. Among the 4 people that we have taken up, none of them have got an international organization behind them, to push their case and to agitate among kind of big government, to try to say enough is enough and the case should be taken up.
I just want to add to that. If a politician, you asked if the international community might interfere in this, if a politician or any other person interferes in the UK, for example, with an investigation by a law enforcement authority, there's a set of words used to describe that, and it's a crime called perverting the course of justice, which is imprisonable. And as our group, we'll be looking very carefully at individual politicians that might seek to interfere with the International Criminal Court's jurisdiction and investigations, and to look at very carefully if action can be brought against those individuals as well. Just go to the side there.
Yeah. My name is Musa. I have one question with 3 parts. First is, can you tell us about the time scale for the investigation and hearing? And also about the perpetrator or the suspicious perpetrators. Does that include senior commanders of the Israeli army or senior politicians. And thirdly, all of us know that the Israeli careless about the international law. I mean, does that case will deter Israel to assault more Palestinian or more journalists, Palestinian journalists?
Thank you. Jennifer, if you'd like to take that.
Thank you for your question. First on timeline, we will be updating our ICC complaint as soon as possible. We've started gathering the evidence that has very helpfully been put together by various media organisations and from our colleagues on the ground, the PGS. Once that information is submitted, we'll continue to do advocacy to the ICC prosecutor to take the case up and open an investigation. And if there is a future prosecution, and we hope there will be, we will be seeking to formally represent our clients in that prosecution as their victim representatives in any future hearing. But the timelines are so far at this point unclear, but we will be pressing hard for it to move ahead as quickly as possible. As to the identity of the perpetrators, that will be an ongoing matter for investigation.
Any other questions? Gentleman here.
Samoudi from Untold Stories podcast. Question to Jennifer and Type. Is the ICC prosecutor obliged to open this investigation after your submission or not? And my question to Walid, in view of Al Jazeera decision to take the Shireen's file to ICC, do you expect more obstacles and put against your journalistic work and coverage in Palestine by the Israeli occupation authorities? Thank you.
Jennifer, could answer the ICC question first.
Sure. With respect to the ICC prosecutor, he has a discretion to open the investigation, and we say that he ought to exercise that discretion on the grounds that this is a widespread and systematic problem. We've heard from Jim about how many Palestinian journalists have been killed in the past decade, let alone this year, let alone last year, and that these cases are emblematic of the broader problem. So it would be right and proper for the prosecutor to open the investigation, and important that he does.
Molly? Do you expect?
Difficulties we have all the time, and we expect even escalation in that. But the heavy price we do, and we will continue doing our job.
Just at the back, gentleman there. You too.
Nadine Barber from Al Jazeera. A question for Tayyab, really. How hopeful are you that the ICC can, down the line, achieve any kind of justice for Shireen and other Palestinian journalists, given the fact that Israel is not party to the ICC and given its track record of non-investigation?
I mean, I have to be as confident as the pre-trial chamber ruling, and the pre-trial chamber ruling is very clear. The ICC's jurisdiction, criminal jurisdiction, extends over the territories that we're speaking about. That means that the ICC prosecutor can issue a warrant for the arrest of perpetrators, if the action or the crime took place in that territory under its jurisdiction. And then that has severe consequences for the individual perpetrator, whether they're inside Israel or not. You may well be aware that many countries have reciprocal legislation. So, for example, the United Kingdom has legislation which means that it's also obliged to prosecute people under the Rome Statute in our jurisdiction, and also in some circumstances hand people over to the ICC where a prosecution is likely to happen. Now, I don't see any reason why, if the rules are applied and they're not interfered with, why perpetrators from Israel will not be prosecuted. Other questions? Okay, thank you very much for your time. That concludes our press conference. Thank you.
Thank you.